To understand the anatomy of a national collapse, one must first understand the seduction of the dream that preceded it. The destruction of the Greek economy was not an event that happened overnight, nor was it merely a consequence of global market forces. It was a slow-motion tragedy born of a specific desire, the desire of a small, peripheral nation to sit at the high table of European power. In the late 1990s, the European Union was embarking on its most ambitious project since the end of the Second World War. They were creating a single currency, the euro. This was not just about money, it was about identity. It was about binding the continent together so tightly that war would become impossible, and prosperity would be shared by all. For Greece, the birthplace of democracy, but also a nation plagued by decades of political instability, military juntas, and economic volatility, the euro was the ultimate prize. Membership meant security. It meant access to the deepest capital markets in the world. It meant low interest rates that would fuel growth and modernization. It was the ticket to the first world, but the ticket had a price, and the price was strict. To ensure the stability of this new currency, the architects of the Eurozone drafted the Maastricht Treaty. This document laid out the convergence criteria, a set of ironclad financial rules that every member state had to obey. The two most critical numbers were simple. A country's annual budget deficit could not exceed 3% of its gross domestic product, and its total national debt could not exceed 60% of GDP. These were the gatekeepers. If you couldn't meet these numbers, you couldn't join the club. For Germany or France, these targets were ambitious but manageable. For Greece, they were a fantasy. The Greek economy in the late 90s was a structural mess. It was characterized by a bloated public sector that served as a patronage network for political parties, a tax collection system that was more suggestion than law, and a massive black market economy that operated entirely off the books. The government in Athens, led by Prime Minister Kostas Simitis, was desperate. They had staked their entire political reputation on joining the euro. To miss the boat would be a national humiliation and a political death sentence. So, facing a reality that did not match the requirements, they decided to change the reality. Or, more accurately, they decided to change how the reality looked on paper. Even before the investment bankers arrived, Athens had begun engaging in what is politely called creative accounting. They stopped counting certain military expenditures in the current budget, pushing them into future years. They capitalized interest payments. They seized the surpluses of social security funds to plug holes in the general budget. Through a heroic effort of statistical manipulation and genuine austerity measures, Greece managed to squeeze its numbers just inside the margins. In June 2000, the European Council officially accepted Greece as the 12th member of the Eurozone. The celebrations in Syntagma Square were raucous. The drachma, the currency of Greece for millennia, was retired. The euro was the future. But the morning after the party, the headache set in. The Maastricht criteria were not just entrance requirements, they were ongoing rules. You had to stay within the limits to avoid penalties and maintain the confidence of the bond markets. Almost immediately after joining, Greece's numbers began to slide back towards their natural, unsustainable state. The structural reforms hadn't really taken root. The numbers had just been massaged. By 2001, the deficit was creeping up again, threatening to breach the 3% limit and expose the fragility of the Greek position. Athens needed a miracle. They needed a way to make debt disappear, and they needed to do it in a way that wouldn't alert the statisticians at Eurostat, the EU's auditing wing. This is the moment when the shark entered the water. It was 2001. The scene shifts from the sun-drenched offices of Athens ministries to the glass and steel towers of London and New York. Goldman Sachs International, the European arm of the world's most powerful investment bank, saw an opportunity. Goldman was not just a bank, it was a factory of financial complexity. They employed armies of physicists and mathematicians, quants, who spent their days designing financial products so intricate that few regulators could understand them, let alone regulate them. The bankers at Goldman knew that Greece was in trouble. They knew the Greek debt management agency was hunting for a solution, and they knew exactly what to pitch. The instrument they proposed was called a cross-currency swap. In the boring, legitimate world of corporate finance, a swap is a standard tool used to manage risk. It works like this. Imagine Greece has borrowed money in Japanese yen and US dollars because interest rates in those countries were low at the time. Eventually, Greece has to pay that money back, but Greece collects taxes in euros. If the euro drops in value against the yen, Greece's debt gets more expensive. To protect themselves, they can swap that yen debt into euro debt with a bank. They agree to an exchange rate, locking in their costs. It's a safety measure, like buying insurance. But the deal Goldman Sachs brought to Athens, codenamed Aeolus, after the Greek god of the winds, was not designed for safety. It was designed for camouflage. The genius of the Goldman proposal lay in the exchange rate. When you normally swap currencies, you use the spot rate, the market price of the currency at that exact second. If €1 is worth 100 yen today, that's the rate you use. Goldman, however, proposed using a fictional exchange rate. They looked back in history and found an exchange rate that was much more favorable to Greece than the current market reality. Imagine you walk into a bank to exchange dollars for euros. The board on the wall says $1 buys you 90 cents. But the banker leans over and whispers, "I'll give you a special deal. I'll give you €1 and 20 cents for every dollar." You would take that deal immediately. You would walk out of the bank with way more cash than you should have. But the banker isn't a charity. He explains that in exchange for this off-market rate, you have to pay him back a little bit more every year for the next 20 years. Effectively, that extra cash you got up front is a loan. It is money you have to repay with interest. This is exactly what Goldman did for Greece. By using a historical off-market exchange rate to swap Greece's dollar and yen debt into euros, the math resulted in a massive upfront credit for Greece. The transaction generated a cash windfall of approximately 2.8 billion euros. In the real world, this 2.8 billion was a loan. It was money Goldman advanced to Greece that Greece would have to pay back later. But in the magical world of European accounting rules circa 2001, because this loan was wrapped inside a complex derivative trade, it didn't count as debt. It was an off-balance sheet item. It was a loophole the size of the Acropolis, and Goldman drove a truck full of cash right through it. For the Greek government, this was the miracle they had prayed for. With one signature, they could take 2.8 billion euros of debt off their books. The deficit would instantly shrink. The 3% target would be met. The Brussels bureaucrats would be happy. The markets would stay calm. The party could continue. The deal was signed in secrecy. The intricate details of the contract were known only to a handful of people in the Greek Debt Management Agency and the Goldman team. The fee structure was staggering. Goldman Sachs knew they were the only ones who could facilitate a deal of this magnitude and complexity on such short notice. They charged Greece roughly 600 million euros in fees, a substantial percentage of the deal's value. But even more lucrative than the upfront fees were the long-term implications. Greece was now locked into a repayment schedule that would stretch for decades. They had essentially taken out a high-interest credit card to pay off their mortgage, all to keep up appearances for the neighbors. For a few years, the gamble seemed to pay off. The Aeolus swap did its job. Greece's reported deficit remained superficially low. The country basked in the glow of the euro. Cheap credit flooded the nation. Greeks bought Porsches and built vacation homes. The government embarked on massive infrastructure projects. In 2004, Athens hosted the Olympic Games, a spectacle of gold and glory that cost nearly 9 billion euros, far over budget. But no one seemed to care because the credit lines were open and the books looked balanced. The illusion of prosperity was intoxicating. The economy was growing, fueled by borrowed money that was invisible to the public eye. But beneath the surface, the rot was spreading. The swap deal with Goldman wasn't a static thing. It was a living, breathing financial beast. The terms of the deal were tied to market fluctuations. As global interest rates and exchange rates shifted in the years following 2001, the value of the swap began to turn violently against Greece. The amount they owed Goldman Sachs started to balloon. The 2.8 billion they had saved was mutating into a liability much larger than the original debt. By 2005, the situation was becoming critical. The swap was underwater. Greece was facing margin calls, demands to put up more cash to cover the deteriorating position of the trade. The Greek government, now realizing they had grabbed a tiger by the tail, went back to Goldman Sachs. They needed to fix the fix. They needed to restructure the deal. This is where the tragedy deepened. A prudent advisor might have told Greece to cut its losses, admit the accounting trickery, and pay the cost. But Goldman was not a fiduciary advisor in that sense. They were a counterparty. They were on the other side of the trade. In 2005, Goldman proposed a solution to the problem they had helped create. They would restructure the swap. They would lock in the losses Greece had already incurred, add them to the principal amount, and extend the repayment period all the way out to 2037. It was the classic extend and pretend strategy. They kicked the can down the road, but the can was getting heavier and heavier. This restructuring increased the total amount Greece would eventually have to pay by billions. It also increased the annual interest payments, but critically, it kept the immediate payments low enough that the Greek budget didn't explode. The secrecy was maintained. The debt remained hidden in the shadows of the balance sheet, a dark matter that exerted gravitational pull on the economy but couldn't be seen by the telescope of the public. During this period, the relationship between the bank and the state became symbiotic. Goldman Sachs bankers were frequent visitors to Athens. They weren't just service providers. They were architects of the nation's financial reality. At one point, Goldman even sold a portion of the swap to a Greek national bank, effectively transferring some of the risk onto the Greek banking system itself while retaining the management fees. They were securitizing the deception. And so Greece sailed on, a ship with a gaping hole in its hull, patched over with paper and promises. The political class in Athens, from both major parties, became complicit in the silence. To reveal the swap would be to admit to a decade of lies. It would mean political suicide. So they kept signing the papers. They kept the swap alive. They hoped that future growth, or perhaps a miracle, would make the problem go away before the bill came due. But history rarely offers miracles to those who cook the books. In 2008, across the Atlantic, the housing market in the United States began to collapse. Lehman Brothers fell. The global financial system seized up. The era of easy money, the era that had allowed Greece to float on a sea of debt, ended in a single afternoon. The tide was going out, and soon the world would see exactly who had been swimming naked. The year 2008 was the tremor, but 2009 was the earthquake. When the global credit markets froze, the easy flow of cheap money that had sustained the Greek illusion suddenly evaporated. For a decade, Greece had borrowed money as if it were Germany, paying almost the same low interest rates. Investors, lulled by the security of the Eurozone and the supposedly sound statistics coming out of Athens, had asked no questions. But when fear gripped the world, investors started checking the receipts. They started looking at the fundamental health of the economies they were lending to. And when they looked at Greece, the numbers didn't add up. In October 2009, a general election in Greece brought a new government to power. The Pan-Hellenic socialist movement, known as PASOK, led by George Papandreou, swept into office on a wave of promises to protect wages and boost spending. But when the new finance ministers walked into the Treasury building in Athens and opened the books, the color drained from their faces. The previous administration hadn't just fudged the numbers a little, they had completely lost control. The statistical fraud that had begun with the Goldman Sachs swap in 2001 had grown into a systemic culture of denial. Weeks after taking office, Prime Minister Papandreou made a stunning announcement that would change the course of European history. He admitted to the world that the Greek budget deficit for that year was not the projected 6% or even the alarming 8% that some had feared. It was 12.7%. It was more than 4 times the limit allowed by the European Union. And the national debt wasn't $300 billion. It was likely far higher. The country was effectively insolvent. The admission was like lighting a match in a room full of gasoline. The bond markets panicked. The cost for Greece to borrow money, the yield on its bonds, skyrocketed. In financial terms, this is the death spiral. As interest rates go up, the debt becomes harder to pay, so investors get more scared, so they demand even higher interest rates, making the debt even harder to pay. Greece was trapped. And in the middle of this firestorm, the hidden skeleton in the closet, the Goldman Sachs swap, was finally dragged into the light. As auditors and European investigators descended on Athens to figure out how the numbers had been so wrong for so long, the Aeolus deal was unearthed. The true toxicity of that financial instrument became clear. It wasn't just that it had hidden 2.8 billion euros of debt a decade earlier, it was that the deal itself had become a financial cancer. Because of the complex restructuring in 2005 and the way the repayment terms were linked to market volatility, the amount Greece owed on that single transaction had ballooned. Reports emerged suggesting that the liability from the swap had swelled to over 5 billion euros. Think about that. A deal designed to save 2.8 billion had ended up costing nearly double that amount. It was a predatory loan on a sovereign scale. The upfront cash was long gone, spent on Olympics infrastructure and public sector raises, but the bill was now due exactly when Greece had no money to pay it. The revelation of the swap deal added a layer of moral outrage to the financial panic. It confirmed to the German and French taxpayers, who were being asked to bail out Greece, that the Greeks had not just been incompetent, they had been deceitful, and they had been aided and abetted by Wall Street. The narrative shifted. Greece wasn't just a victim of a market crash, it was a perpetrator of a fraud. This hardened the hearts of the European negotiators. If Greece wanted help, they argued, it would have to pay a terrible price. That price was the memorandum. To avoid a chaotic default that would have forced Greece out of the euro and potentially destroyed the European Union, the Troika, the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund agreed to loan Greece hundreds of billions of euros to pay its debts. But in exchange, they demanded the most savage austerity program in modern history. They demanded that Greece dismantle its public sector. They demanded that pensions be slashed by 40%. They demanded that the minimum wage be cut. They demanded massive tax hikes on a population that was already drowning. The logic was cold and mathematical. You spent too much for too long. Now you must starve to balance the books. The impact on Greek society was apocalyptic. It was a Great Depression in the 21st century. Between 2009 and 2014, the Greek economy shrank by 25%. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the same contraction the United States suffered during the Great Depression of the 1930s. But this was happening in a modern European democracy. Unemployment soared. It didn't just double, it tripled. At the peak of the crisis, nearly 28% of Greeks were out of work. For young people, the number was over 60%. A generation of graduates, engineers, and doctors saw no future in their own country. They packed their bags and left for Berlin, London, or New York, creating a brain drain that will cripple Greece for decades to come. In Athens, the cityscapes changed. Stores shuttered by the thousands. Families who had considered themselves middle class suddenly found themselves lining up at soup kitchens run by the Orthodox Church. In the evenings, the air in the cities grew thick with smog because people could no longer afford heating oil. They were burning furniture and trash in their fireplaces to stay warm. The healthcare system began to crumble. Hospitals ran out of basic antibiotics, bandages, and cancer drugs. The human toll was measured in more than just euros. The suicide rate in Greece, historically one of the lowest in Europe, spiked by 40%. It became a grim routine to hear stories of pensioners stepping off balconies because they could not bear the shame of poverty, or small business owners taking their own lives after bankruptcy. And where was Goldman Sachs while Athens burned? They were safe. They had long since secured their fees. The estimated 600 million euros they made from the original deal was banked. The risk of the swap had been largely offloaded or hedged. When the anger of the world turned toward them, when executives were hauled before hearings in Brussels and Washington, their defense was cool, legalistic, and technically accurate. We broke no laws, they said, and they were right. They had followed the rules as they were written at the time. They argued that they merely provided a service that their client, the Greek government, had explicitly requested. They pointed out that Eurostat, the EU's watchdog, had been vague on the rules regarding derivatives. They claimed that the swap was a tiny fraction of Greece's total debt, a drop in the ocean compared to the country's massive structural problems. But this defense ignored the fundamental nature of the transaction. The swap was not about financial management, it was about deception. It was a tool designed specifically to circumvent the democratic controls of the European Union. By helping Greece hide the smoke, Goldman Sachs allowed the fire to smolder undetected for years, ensuring that when it finally burst into flames, it would consume the entire house. The legacy of the Aeolus deal is not just a footnote in a financial textbook. It changed the way the world looks at sovereign debt. It shattered the trust between European nations. It fueled a rise in populism and anti-EU sentiment that is still being felt today. It proved that in the modern global economy, finance has outpaced democracy. Banks can create instruments so complex that they can hide the bankruptcy of a nation. And they can do it legally, profiting all the way down. Today, Greece is slowly recovering. The economy is growing again. Tourists have returned to the islands. The deficits are under control, but the scars are permanent. The debt from the bailout years is so massive that Greece will be paying it off until the year 2060. The children born in Athens today, who had nothing to do with the swap or the lies of 2001, will spend their working lives paying taxes to service debts created by a handshake between a desperate minister and a clever banker. The Goldman Sachs deal stands as a monument to the era of hubris. It is a reminder that there is no such thing as free money, that numbers on a balance sheet eventually translate into human suffering, and that when you invite the masters of the financial universe to help you cheat reality, you might win the hand, but you will eventually lose the game. The Aeolus swap was a wind that blew Greece off a cliff, and the fall is something the country is still trying to climb back from. Thanks for watching. If you found this analysis valuable, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more untold stories from financial history. I'll see you in the next one.